I'm Anna.
I'm Jessica. And this is the Paranoia Pair.
I did make a note of the Mission Expressway in my phone, just so you know. I did write it down from the Teke Teke episode. If I get asked for legs, I know where to find them.
Great, I already forgot.
Okay. Don't worry, just text me.
One second, Hannah.
Where am I supposed to?
Okay, so Jack the Ripper.
Obviously, it's a well-known case, but with everything going around and like how it's been supposedly solved, I really wanted to cover it.
That works though, because I have never actually listened to a full case about Jack the Ripper.
Okay. Now you're being forced to.
I'm ready to learn.
Okay. So it was the late summer of 1888 in London, and it was plunged into fear and terror because there was a serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, and he killed at least 5 women in like the most fucked up way. He mutilated their bodies, and the way he did it, he had to have had like some kind of a human like anatomy knowledge. Experts and enthusiasts from all over the world obviously have been trying to solve this, and in my opinion, I don't think it's solved.
Do either of the people who, or the one who DNA matched, did he have any like medical knowledge that would have made him?
Possibly. And I'm like, there's actually been 2 instances of where they supposedly solved it. So I think that just kind of like goes to like prove
That it's probably not very.
yeah, it's probably not very reliable. But there's actually a name for like the enthusiasts of this case, and they're called ripperologists, which I think is like kind of cool.
It is kind of cool. Well, it also works out good because meteorologists are never reliable.
Mm-hmm.
And since the ripperologists keep getting wrong, well, I mean, it goes ripperologist, meteorologist, you can't count on them.
No.
They can be wrong.
The weather app is always wrong. Explain that to me.
I just think of Josh Peck's dad in Drake and Josh and how everybody was always mad at him because he was a meteorologist and he always, like, his forecast was always wrong.
Yeah, like literally, it'll be sprinkling and I'll open the weather app and it'll say it's sunny outside.
With like 0% chance of participation.
Just like, okay. So the only thing that everybody is basically certain of is that there were at least 5 victims and they were actually given a name. They're called the canonical 5. And this term was first used in 1987 by a researcher named Martin Fido. All 5 of the killings took place within a mile of each other around the Whitechapel district of London, and that's on the East End. And it started in August of 1888. Whitechapel was known for like poor living conditions, and it was prominently occupied by Jewish and Russian immigrants. Poor conditions aside, it was still really popular. It was visited a lot by like higher status like white men, and they would go to pubs to go have like a beer and like go visit some sex workers.
The usual.
Yeah.
Usual weekend.
Yeah. And they would also like go and listen to like the music that was playing in the pubs and stuff. The first victim we are going to get into is Mary Ann Nichols. She's the first known victim of the canonical 5. And she died on Friday, August 31st. Some background on Mary Ann is she was born in 1845. She got married in 1864 and had 5 children.
Dang.
Yeah. But her marriage ended by 1880. Mary Ann claimed that her husband had been unfaithful, and he claimed that Mary Ann was an alcoholic. As a result of her divorce, she became unstable, and she was what we have coined today as couch surfing. She was getting an allowance that was paid by her ex-husband. He actually eventually stopped paying it, though, due to her living a, quote, immoral lifestyle. She tried holding down a few jobs, and she even became a domestic servant, but that only lasted 3 months because she had ran away with 3 pounds worth of their clothing.
They probably had enough.
Probably. I mean, if they could afford a domestic servant.
You can lose some clothes.
Yeah.
3 pounds of it, it's not that much.
I don't know if that was, like, the worth of the clothes or if that was, like, the weight.
I was over here imagining it was the weight, and I'm like, "That's probably, like, one
That's
of
a
their
lot.
dresses."
Well, yeah. Yeah, because I guess, like, the whole get-up and stuff, like, back then, it was so heavy. I could not be a woman back then.
Wonder how much I'm gonna look up what 3 pounds was back then, money-wise. It's worth 498 pounds and 30 cents
Dang.
as of today. Okay, so
That's, like
that's a lot.
that's a lot of
So
money and
they're
clothing.
yeah.
In August 1888, that same month that Mary died, she was just scraping by and she started staying in a lodging house. August 30th, she went to a local pub called the Frying Pan Pub and got drunk. And I just think that's such a good name for a pub. Like, I would definitely want to go there. And I bet they have like the best food when you're
I was gonna
drunk.
say that, I bet they've got really good food with that
Yeah.
name.
Like
Greasy
breakfast
stuff.
food. Oh my God. I love a breakfast sandwich. Drunk. Can't go wrong. She got so drunk that she spent the money she needed for a night at the lodging house and was turned away at the door. It's suspected that she had walked away and planned on doing some sex work to earn some more money so she
Ugh.
could go back. But around 2:30 in the morning, she ran into Emily Holland, and Emily was staying at the same lodging house. She tried to convince Marianne to return to the lodging house, but she had refused. And Emily did say that Marianne seemed to be drunk still. So probably not making good decisions. Um, Emily was actually the last person to see her alive because around an hour later, Marianne's body was found slumped over on Buck Row.
Wow, only
Yeah,
an hour later.
yeah. Her throat was cut and she had been stabbed in the vagina
Oh,
and the
what?
abdomen. And they found a straw hat that she was wearing close by. Painful.
So this person obviously has some
Yeah, definitely hates women.
yeah.
Victim number 2 is Anne Chapman. On the morning of September 8th, 1888, Annie Chapman became the second known victim. She was born in 1840 and she had a rough life growing up. Her father had actually died by suicide when she was young, and as a result of that, she began drinking at a very young age.
Do all of the victims drink?
Yes, unfortunately, they are all alcoholics.
Okay.
I don't blame them though.
No, yeah.
Like,
Being a woman back then and no dad growing up,
yeah, and they
it
had like the plague and stuff to deal with, like, and they were like losing children.
I bet their alcohol was wild back then.
In 1869, she married John Chapman and they had 3 children together. Unfortunately, one was born with a disability and had been placed in an institution, and another one had died at the age of 12 years old.
No.
Both Annie and John became heavy drinkers, which I don't blame them at all.
Feel bad for the third kid though that had to deal with.
Because of their heavy drinking, it led to their divorce in the mid 1880s, and the court had actually blamed Annie's drunk and immoral ways as a result, but John still sent her 10 shillings a week until he died of liver disease. And I know you're Jessica picked up her phone to Google it. 10 British shillings from 1888 would be roughly equivalent to 80 US dollars in today's money.
That's a pretty good deal.
And that's a week.
That's pretty
So,
good.
yeah, especially at that time, like everything was so cheap.
Yeah.
With no financial support, Annie did end up in a lodging house and she turned to sex work to survive. By 1888, she was staying at Crossing Ham's lodging house, where others described her as being sickly but harmless. In September, Annie's health had gotten even worse. Um, People saw her taking pills and drinking medicine, and she had often complained about feeling too sick to work, and it's believed that she possibly was dealing with tuberculosis and syphilis.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So, and we do know how they were treating syphilis if you listen to my Tuskegee syphilis experiment episode with poison. uh yeah, so I mean, that would explain why she was feeling so sick. Um in the early hours of September 8th, she was turned away from her lodging house because she didn't have the money for a bed. But she promised to come back soon with the money. Uh
Sex work?
Yep. Unfortunately, Annie never made it back. Around 5:30 in the morning, a witness seen her talking to a man before they disappeared into the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Just 30 minutes later, a passerby found her body. Her throat had been slit and her stomach was cut open. Her intestines were actually pulled out of her body, and the most fucked up part is that the killer had carefully removed her uterus and part of her vagina and most of her bladder.
Were those around the body, or did he like take them with him?
He took them with them. They were gone. So obviously this person has like probably some kind of medical knowledge or something.
I hope that she wasn't still alive when he started.
She probably was dead pretty fast after her throat was slit.
Hopefully.
The third victim was Elizabeth Stride. She was born in 1843. Her birth name was Elizabeth. Ooh, I'm gonna fuck this up. Elizabeth Gustafsdotter of Sweden.
I like it.
She made her way to England in 1866, and she married a man named John Thomas Stride in 1869, but they were divorced by 1881. John died of tuberculosis in 1884, but Elizabeth would tell people that he and their child, who did not exist, died in a shipwreck in the River Thames and that she had survived the wreck. I'm wondering if like she would do this as like a sob story to get like handouts or something. Elizabeth used sex work to make ends meet, and she was also an alcoholic, and she would be arrested 8 times for drunken disorderly conduct. By 1888, she was living in a lodging house. On September 29th, Stride cleaned 2 rooms at the lodging house and received 6 pence. I don't know what that means. It's like very, very old.
It's worth 1/40th of a pound.
Oh, God. So it's like nothing.
Not much. Yeah, it said or 6 pennies. So
She got paid 6 fucking pennies.
it's like my grandma
Oh
when
my
she'd make me
God.
dust all of her stuff and I'd get like a nickel. Don't spend it all in one place.
She then got dressed up in some nice clothes and then went out. There were multiple witnesses that seen Elizabeth with men, and it wasn't clear if they were like multiple men or if it was just the same one. A little after midnight, a man named Israel Schwartz saw a man walk up to Elizabeth to talk to her and then grabbed her and threw her to the ground. Obviously, he was scared and he ended up running away from the scene.
But what the
so
fuck
he
is real?
wouldn't get hurt. Less than an hour later, her body was found. Her throat had been cut so deeply that she was almost decapitated. She wasn't as brutally murdered like Jack's other victims, but it's speculated that they were interrupted during the murder, and that's why it would explain why she wasn't like
As
mutilated like the others. 45 minutes later, Jack the Ripper's 4th victim would be found.
so he did 2 in one night?
Named Catherine Eddowes. Catherine was born in 1842, and she spent many years of her life with a man named Thomas Conway. They weren't married, though. They did have 3 children together, and Catherine even had TC tattooed on her arm, which I think it's crazy. They were tattooing back then. What were tattoo machines like? I need to know.
Probably poke and stick.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
That's badass though. A woman with a tattoo in the 1800s?
They made a living by selling cheap novels and gallows ballads. So the two split in 1888, and it was due to Catherine's supposed drinking habits. She did end up moving into a lodging house, and she met a man there named John Kelly. She took his last name. It wasn't officially, though. They harvested hops to try and make some money. Catherine was very poor. She went to stay at a ward where the poor could go and stay when they were sick. In a last-ditch effort to make some money, Catherine had a conversation with the superintendent of the ward, saying that she planned to go catch Jack the Ripper and earn the reward because she said, that she thought she knew who it was, like, personally.
Wonder if she did, and that's why she's a victim.
I don't know. I mean, that would make sense. Um, I wanna know who she thought it was. Catherine was kicked out of the ward. It's not really given why, but she desperately needed money, and she told John that she was going to ask her daughter for some money, but she, went out and got drunk instead. Police found her sprawled out on the ground on Aldgate Street around 8 p.m., and they took her to the Bishop Police Station to sleep it off. The police ended up letting her go around midnight on September 30th. There were 3 witnesses who saw her speaking to a man around 1:30 in the morning, and Catherine's body was discovered in Mitra Square around 1:45 a.m. Catherine's murder would be one of the most brutal of the 5.
Wait, what time was she seen with the man?
She was seen with him at 1:30, and her dead body was found at 1:45. So in 15 minutes, her throat had been cut, she had been disemboweled, her face was mutilated, and her left kidney and most of her uterus was removed, all in 15 minutes. Insane.
How? I've never murdered somebody, but, like, I feel like that takes a lot longer than 15 minutes. That's wild.
It takes me 15 minutes to go to the bathroom.
It takes me 15 minutes to cut an onion.
Investigators suspected that the killer had taken out his rage on her after being interrupted during Elizabeth's murder, which would make sense. And it would also explain why she was like the most brutally murdered. It also would make sense if she knew the killer.
Yeah.
I still want to know who the heck that was. Okay. So on September 27th, 1888, there was a letter that was written to the boss of the Central News Office, City London. And it was dated September 25th, but it wasn't sent out until 2 days later, which implies that Jack the Ripper added information he got from the media coverage about his case. And it reads, "Dear Boss, 25 September of 1888. I keep hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I've laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track that the joke about Leather Apron, which was the name that they were giving him, gave me real fits. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my little funny games. I saved some of the proper red stuff off a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ear off and send it to police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha.
LOL.
LOL. So we may never know if the letter was truly written by Jack.
Wait, isn't there one more victim?
Seeing as the letter was sent shortly before the double murder, and it contained a note that the writer wanted to cut off the lady's ears and send them to the police, the investigation of Catherine Eddowes stated that an attempt was actually made to cut off her right ear. So that connects the two. And it probably wasn't like publicly released, that part. So it's plausible to assume that it was authentic and actually was written by Jack the Ripper, which I am on board with.
It'd be bad if it wasn't because then a fake person would have coined the name Jack the Ripper.
And I will actually get into another victim, a possible victim, who also had an issue with her ear, and she was attacked. Okay. So the fifth victim was Mary Jane Kelly, and she is the last of the canonical five. She was born in 1863 in Ireland, and she was briefly married to a coal miner, but he died in an accident, and Mary Jane turned to sex work for money. By 1884, she was living in London and working at an upscale brothel. In 1886, she bumped into Joseph Barnett at Cooley's lodging house. They barely knew each other, but they decided to move in together, even though they had only met apparently twice. The first place they lived in didn't last long since they got kicked out for getting drunk and skipping out on rent. And after that, they moved into 13 Miller's Court on Dorset Street. Barnett lost his job, so Mary Jane went back to sex work. Even though they had a fight and he left, they still saw each other, and he even went to visit Mary Jane on November 8th, 1888, the night before she died. He stayed for an hour and left around 8 p.m. Later that night, she went out drinking at pubs, and multiple witnesses seen her. Mary Jane was heard singing in her room into the early hours of November 9th when the singing stopped. Just before noon, her landlord came to collect rent, but nobody answered, so he looked through the window and saw her mutilated body. The police soon arrived, and they seen the 25-year-old in her bed with her head turned. Her abdominal cavity was carved out, parts of her face and breasts were cut off, and part of her left arm was removed. Her organs were also spread across the room, and her heart was missing.
Her ear was on?
I do believe so.
Hmm.
Her ears, I believe, were intact. Okay.
Do you think he was like eating the things he took home?
I don't know.
Because there's always like, I don't know, like the meat of the arm or like the organs.
Yeah, he was taking organs. That's a good question.
And also, I'm not victim blaming.
No.
But it's crazy when I hear when you hear stories of this. Listen, if somebody got murdered in our town, like after they left a bar, I mean, I don't go to bars as is, but like you bet your like tootie booty that I am not going to be going out drinking.
Yeah. Well, these people are also alcoholics, though, too.
Drink in your lodge house, can't you? Wouldn't it be cheaper?
Well, and they also are relying on sex work for money.
Freaking husbands dying, leaving their wives to have
I
to support
know.
themselves.
So the similarities between all these cases are they were all women and they were all sex workers. Everyone was killed with a knife and sometimes horribly mauled and put on display. Also, everyone but Mary Jane Kelly was killed out on the streets at nighttime. She was the only one killed behind closed doors and brutally mutilated. And the fact that every killing happened on a weekend or a national holiday suggests that the Ripper had to work during the week. He also had to possess at least basic knowledge of anatomy, and the injuries he caused further suggest that he was used to working with knives. And this would imply that he might be a butcher, doctor, or something in that sort of craft, which is why they were calling him Leather Apron. So, other than the so-called canonical five, there were even more victims before and after. And they may or may not have been caused by Jack the Ripper. So the Ripperologists around the world dispute whether or not some of these unsolved murder cases before and after the canonical five would be considered in connection with Jack the Ripper. Official general police file for murders in this region was called the Whitechapel murders, and it had a total of 11 victims. 2 before the canonical five and 4 after the canonical five. The earliest Whitechapel murder case was Emma Elizabeth Smith. She was born in 1845 and she had separated from her husband in 1878, along with shutting out any connections of her past life. So there isn't really much recollection into her background. In 1887, she started staying at a local lodging house. She was a 45-year-old widow and she relied on sex work for money.
Okay, so that goes right
Mhm.
along with.
Yeah. And notice how all of these people were staying at lodging houses too, or they had, like, some kind of connection to lodging houses. The keeper of the lodging house recalled seeing Emma with black eyes multiple times and remembers on one occasion, Emma stated that she was thrown out of a window. Insane.
Good grief.
Emma was also an alcoholic and acted irrationally when she was drunk. On April 2nd, 1888, Emma left the lodge house that she was staying at to go out drinking and to do some sex work. Tuesday, April 3rd, 1888, 15 minutes after midnight, Margaret Hayes, who stayed at the same lodging house, had seen Emma talking to a man on Farrant Street. Oh, he was wearing dark clothing along with a white neckerchief. It had been a rough night for Margaret, having been assaulted by two men. So she was on her way back to the lodging house. The man talking to Emma didn't look like any of the men who had attacked Margaret, so she continued on her way back to the house. Between the hours of 4 and 5 o'clock that morning, Emma made her way back to the lodging house. The keeper was deeply concerned when she walked in with her face bleeding and ear badly cut and had injuries on the lower part of her body. She had been robbed of all her money by a group of 2 or 3 men. The youngest was estimated to be around 19. The keeper was able to convince Emma to go to a hospital for her injuries, thankfully. The doctor who examined Emma was horrified by her injuries. A portion of her right ear was torn, and the lining of her abdomen and other internal organs had been ruptured. He believed that the injuries had been inflicted by a blunt object that was thrusted into her body. Emma's injuries unfortunately slipped her into a coma, and she died the next morning on April 4th at 9 o'clock. Violence against women was pretty common in the East Ends, and gangs were a really big problem, especially in big cities like London. They would often go around attacking and robbing people and avoiding the law. Although she does fit the same criteria as the other women, being an alcoholic and a sex worker, Emma's murder is often dismissed as being in connection with the Ripper because she was brutally attacked. She did lack the typical mutilation style of the other victims. She was also attacked by a group of men, pointing towards a local gang that preyed on sex workers in the area. But this doesn't stop her murder from being brought up in the Ripper case. Most experts and Ripperologists see this case as being separate from the Ripper string, and her death does mark the beginning of the Whitechapel murders, though, and there are a few who believe that she is in fact an early victim despite the difference in MO, which would kind of make sense because when they just start out, it's typical that their behaviors change.
Yeah,
And
and
they do tend to like escalate until they find something that they really like.
and her surviving the initial attack
Mhm.
kind of would make sense with it being like the first Ripper murder because like he didn't realize that he had not done enough damage and like
Yeah.
maybe that's why his attacks got more brutal.
Well, and it's also possible that he maybe was part of this gang and then he decided, I really like doing this, so I'm going to go off and I'm going to continue doing it by myself. That's also a possibility. So, Martha Tabram was the second murderer in the Whitechapel murder file. She was born May 10th, 1849, and on Christmas Day in 1869, she married Henry Tabram when she was in her late teens. They ended up having 2 sons together, and Martha became a heavy drinker. By 1875, her husband had enough of her behavior and left. Martha had actually put a warrant out for Henry's arrest for desertion. When it was brought to the court, Henry had explained that Martha's uncontrollable behavior was why he had left, and he had agreed to pay her 12 shillings a week.
Dang. No, wait. Yeah? Yeah, dang.
Yeah, that's about, let's see, 10 shillings is $80. So
Oh,
I'm assuming 12 had to be like about 90.
dang.
Yeah, that's like $400 a month. Are you kidding me?
That's a win.
Martha wasn't happy with this amount, though, and demanded more money from Henry. In response, Henry reduced the amount he was paying her, and Martha took out another arrest warrant on him. Henry was in turn arrested and forced to pay her the full amount. However, when Henry learned that Martha had taken up sex work, he had refused to pay her any further. In 1879, she started living with William Turner, who was a carpenter, and he also sold trinkets and knickknacks. Love that for him.
Love trinkets and
My
knickknacks.
dream. If I could make a living selling trinkets and knickknacks, happiest woman in the world. He treated her and her children very well, despite them having an on again, off again relationship. Every time he had given her money, she had spent it on alcohol. And on August 6th, 1888, Martha met a friend, Mariana Conley, who was also a sex worker, and they went out for drinks around 10 p.m. They had met with two soldiers at the pub around 11:45, and around midnight, the two each went their own ways, both in company of one of the soldiers that they had been drinking with, likely to perform sex acts. Martha went with her soldier into George Yard, and it's a narrow, dark street that still exists today, but it's under a new name. It's now called Gunthrope Street. Are you going to Google it?
What's if it's a scary narrow yard or street?
Yeah, it's called
Gun?
Gunthrope Street in Whitechapel.
Ooh, yeah, okay. Well,
It's probably not creepy now. Oh, yeah. It's
I wouldn't be walking down there at night.
no.
Anyways, it's a perfect
Murder spot.
It's a perfect murder spot. I didn't know if that was going to be insensitive, but
Honestly.
that's what you think of for the murder spot.
George Yard was a dangerous street in the area, but it was kind of the perfect spot for people to do, quote, business because it provided dark cover and decent privacy. Around 2 a.m., a police officer noticed a soldier that was standing at the entrance of George Yard. The officer made a comment to the soldier about how he should be back in the barracks at this hour, and the soldier replied that he was waiting for his friend, a fellow soldier who had gone with a woman in one of the buildings close by. The officer accepted this response, and he didn't question him any further and continued to patrol the streets. Around 3:30 a.m., Alfred George Crow, who was a cab driver, returned to his home in George Yard. He had seen a person laying on the first floor landing of his building, but people often slept in this landing, so it wasn't really something that he would pay much attention to. He's just like, oh, it's just this person. So he went on his way up to his apartment. Around 4:45, John Saunders Reeves left his apartment in the same building. As he approached the landing, now that there was more lighting, he could see that there was a woman laying on the landing surrounded by a pool of blood. He quickly left to go find a police officer and returned to the building with the same officer who was on patrol that spotted the soldier outside George Yard. The officer then sent Joshua to go get a medic who would pronounce the woman dead when he arrived. She had been brutally murdered. The woman was Martha. She had 39 stab wounds to her throat, chest, and lower abdomen. There was two types of blades that were used, a pocket knife and a bayonet or a dagger. Some of her wounds were suspected to be inflicted after she had already been dead. It was estimated that Martha had died about 2:30 in the morning from hemorrhage and loss of blood. Despite there being a lot of blood between her separated legs, there were no signs that she had had sex. People in the building stated that they didn't see or hear anything unusual. The police on patrol in the area, however, said that there had been several disturbances and that screams and cries for help were heard at midnight and during the early hours of the morning, but they were from separate instances. Attempts to identify these soldiers were unfortunately not successful, and the investigating officers believed that Martha had been a victim of Jack the Ripper. It wasn't officially added because whoever was in charge was like, it doesn't fit this, or whatever. On December 19th, 1888, at 7:55 p.m., Charles Potomley was walking down England Row when he seen a woman with two sailors at the entrance of Clark's Yard. He heard the woman raising her voice, telling the shorter of the two, no, and he had observed him talking to her close, like in a low tone, basically making it harder for others to hear. You know, that thing that men do to like intimidate women. He kept an eye on them and made note of their appearances, and he also says that the woman seemed perfectly sober. At 2:30 in the morning on December 20th, the same woman was seen with two men outside of the George pub on Commercial Road. This time, she was pretty drunk. At 4:30, Police Sergeant Robert Golding and Police Constable Thomas Costello found her body in Clark's yard. Her body was still warm, meaning that her death had been recent. There wasn't any signs of a struggle. As a result, the police believed that she had died by suicide or sudden death from natural causes. The surgeon was called and examined the body, and he didn't find any marks or signs of foul play, so he pronounced her dead and sent her off to the morgue. But the coroner's assistant discovered a mark around her neck along with some scratches, and she later was identified as Rose Mylet. An autopsy was done, and it said blood was oozing from the nostrils, and there was a slight abrasion on the right side of the face. On the neck was a mark which was evidently caused by cord drawing tightly around the neck from the spine to the left ear. Such a mark had been by a fourth thread cord.
Well, that doesn't seem to fit
Yeah.
at all.
There were also impressions of the thumbs and middle and index fingers of some person plainly visible on each side of her neck, and death was due to strangulation. So she obviously could not have done that herself. The marks on her neck were probably caused by her trying to pull the cord off, and the murderer must have stood at the left rear of the woman and having the ends of the cord around his hands, thrown them around her throat and crossed his hands, having strangled her that way. The police and most newspapers were eager to squash that Jack the Ripper was behind Mylet's murder. The press was clearly determined to avoid the sensationalism that had sparked so much panic due to the previous killings. And the evidence does suggest that she hadn't been the victim of Jack, and the majority of experts are in agreement. It does get brought up, though, having happened in the same area and the time period, but it does not have the brutality like the others. So on July 17th, 1889, at 12:50 in the morning, a police officer found the body of a local sex worker named Alice Mackenzie. She was laying close to a lamppost on the pavement in Castle Alley, just off of Whitechapel High Street. Her skirt was pulled up, and there was blood over her thigh and abdomen that was coming from a zigzag-shaped cut that ran from the bottom of her left breast to her belly button, along with two deep, jagged cuts on the left side of her neck. They had found a clay pipe near her body as well. She'd been identified by a man who was staying at the same lodging house, and she was known to be always smoking a tobacco pipe. She smoked so much that she had became known as Clay Pipe Alice, like chain smoker.
Damn.
I bet she had some stories. She was living every chain smoking grandma's dream. There was a debate on whether Alice had been killed by Jack the Ripper or not. The police surgeon didn't believe this was done by Jack, noting that he had examined the body of Annie Chapman. Injuries on Alice were less frenzied and not as deep. The new police commissioner, on the other hand, went as far as stating publicly that he had no doubt that it was Jack. There's still debate today on whether or not this had been Jack or a copycat. And if it was Jack, he obviously had been more restrained.
I say that one seems more like a copycat because they didn't take any.
Her throat wasn't slit either. She had just two stab wounds to her throat. It wasn't cut like all the others. And it wasn't as deep.
And it didn't seem like they did anything with her genitals because like all of the five, it seems like either he had tried taking some out or he stabbed them or and this one they didn't. They just they stabbed around it, didn't it?
She was cut like zigzagged down to her belly button, but
so
nothing was missing. There wasn't anything, like no damage done to her sex organs or anything.
Yeah. And Jack the Ripper seems, I'm coining he's an incel.
Yeah.
And that's why he's going for uteruses.
So on September 10th, 1889, almost a year after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, a female torso was found under a railway arc on Pinchin Street, and it was very decomposed. There was no clear throat slashes or abdominal mutilations like the Ripper's victims, and the torso appeared to have been cleanly severed, suggesting a degree of anatomical knowledge. The body had no signs of blood at the scene, meaning it was likely killed and dismembered somewhere else before being dumped. The identity of the woman was unknown, but 3 nearby men who were sleeping um, under some arches were arrested immediately, but they were later let go and cleared as suspects. Investigators found some blood-stained clothing on Batty Street, but nothing really came of it. Also, I love that name, Batty Street. It's like the place where all goth people want to live.
I feel like London's perfect for goth people.
I know, right? Especially during this time. The name Lydia Hart began circulating, and she was a sex worker who had been missing for a few days, but the identity was never confirmed. The body was found in Whitechapel, the Ripper's hunting ground. However, the killer had dismembered the body instead of slashing the throat and mutilating the abdomen, which was the Ripper's signature. Some believe that this killing was not the Ripper, but rather the work of Thames torso murderer. And they were an unidentified killer who disposed of multiple dismembered bodies in London between 1887 and 1889. And the Pinchin Street torso closely resembled all of these other dismembered cases rather than the Ripper murders. Some have speculated that if the Ripper was experimenting with new techniques, he may have escalated to full dismemberment. This is debated, though, because the Ripper's signature was his grotesque butchery of his victims not dismembering, which I am fully on board with because he really had a thing that he, like, totally was about.
Yeah, I like that they're like, yeah, we found this lone torso. We think it could be Jack the Ripper, or it could be the torso killer.
Yeah. Yeah. For real. So on Friday 13th, 1891, at 2:15 in the morning, the body of Francis Cole was discovered by a police officer. He had passed the spot 15 minutes before and was certain the body hadn't been there then. When he shined his lamp, he found a woman's body in a pool of blood with a throat wound. He heard footsteps and saw a figure on the ground. He blew his whistle, and nearby officers came running. While checking for a pulse, they noticed that the body was still warm and there was a slight pulse. By the time the medic showed up, though, it was too late and she was pronounced dead. They began questioning everybody in the area immediately, and the examiner found 2 cuts on Frances's neck. That was the cause of her death, and that basically was the extent of her injuries. The police surgeon didn't believe that this was Jack's doing, as there was only minimal injuries, but the newspaper had different thoughts. Police actually arrested James Sadler, who had a pretty violent history. There wasn't enough evidence to convict him, though, so he was released. Some ripperologists have a hard time believing that this was the work of Jack because, again, this lacked the brutality that he was known for.
And didn't he more specifically slit the throat?
Mm-hmm.
So stab wounds.
Yeah. Others think that he may have been interrupted in this murder as well. So he couldn't really have time to do anything more. But he works pretty fast. Like with the other one, he 15 minutes he had like disemboweled this lady. Robert Anderson, who took over as head criminal investigation department and assistant commissioner of the Metropolitan Police on August 31st of 1888, believed that Jack the Ripper began with Martha Tabram on August 7th and ended with Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th. In his autobiography titled The Lighter Side of My Official Life, he wrote that the second Whitechapel murder happened the night before he started his job, and the third one was the night that he left London. He also mentioned that the last and most horrible crime occurred in Miller's Court on November 9th. So, there were numerous suspects that were proposed over the years. I'm going to cover basically the most plausible and like the most commonly known or discussed based on evidence and like descriptions and stuff. And I'm also going to include some modern profiling, which I think is kind of fun.
Somewhat.
Like modern profiling.
Oh, okay,
like,
okay.
They were like, this suggests that this. So my first one is going to be Aaron Kosminski. Probably heard him in the news recently. He's a Polish Jewish barber who was named as a suspect by police at the time. He lived in Whitechapel. He was known to have violent tendencies, and he was also institutionalized in an asylum shortly after the murders. He was described as having hallucinations, hearing voices, and refusing to eat food given to him by others because he feared of being poisoned. He hated women, and he hated sex workers even more. And there was a witness who said they seen Aaron Kosminski at the scene of one of the murders. They refused to testify against him, though. No charges were ever brought against him, and it seemed like the witness account was actually secondhand. So they had heard from someone else, and that they were just reiterating this as a fact. There wasn't any clear documentation of him being identified in the police reports or police files. So yeah, you've probably heard him in the news because he was recently named to be the killer. And this was supposedly proven by analyzed mitochondrial DNA that was found on a silk shawl that was supposedly taken from the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes. There are issues with this, though, because mitochondrial DNA is shared by thousands of people in a population, so it does not uniquely identify a suspect. There's no solid evidence that the shawl actually came from the crime scene. It had never been listed in police reports as belonging to Catherine. Actually, the first mention of it being linked to Catherine Eddowes only appeared over a century later, meaning that it could have been contaminated. The shawl was handled by multiple people over the years, and there's a high likelihood of modern DNA contamination, which could definitely mess with the results. Not to mention, people were buying the shawl. Like, it had been passed through owners because people were buying it. So there's no, like, preservation of this DNA. It's probably not being stored properly to preserve the DNA. So there's no way for this to actually like hold up over time. Like it would completely be deteriorated basically. Plus the forensic scientist Russell Edwards, the new owner of the Shaw, worked with Dr. Jari Luhalainen. They have faced credibility issues. In the 2019 peer-reviewed version of this study, Dr. Jari did not publish the actual genetic sequence that he used. The DNA analyst pointed out that when Dr. Jari finally did reveal that the mitochondrial DNA type in the 2009 paper, it did not match the one found in Eddowes' living relatives. So the supposed DNA that belonged to Catherine on that shawl did not match Catherine's living relatives. And there would be some sort of match considering they are in the same family pool.
Right.
So the published mitochondrial DNA sequence were so common that many unrelated people could have been the source. The mitochondrial DNA evidence is weak and it's non-unique. It's widely common. The Shaw has no proven link to Catherine, and it's highly contaminated, and the study was poorly conducted and lacked independent verification. So, in my opinion, I don't think it's credible at all.
So this is the most recent,
Yes.
quote unquote, Jack the Ripper was solved?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is like, it's the one that everyone's basically going with right now, which I can understand why they're going with it because sure, like they hear DNA and they go, oh, it's absolutely confirmed.
That's what I did when I said, Anna, did you hear Jack the Ripper was caught?
But it's only mitochondrial DNA, which is like the most common form of DNA, basically. So the second person is Montag John Druitt. He was a teacher who took his own life in late 1888, shortly after the last canonical murder. He was even reported to be sexually disturbed, and his own family believed he was the killer. The police had no evidence to suggest John was responsible for the murders, but his death by drowning, combined with the fact that the murders abruptly stopped after Kelly's death, led some to believe that he might have been the killer. John was known to be socially isolated. Listen, we're socially isolated, but we would never commit murder, so I feel like that's kind of a weak argument.
I know, they're always saying how, like, like that murderer didn't have many friends, stayed at home.
You're my only friend.
I do feel like some people we went to school with would probably say that, oh, those two definitely would murder somebody.
Right?
Like, no, we can't even approach a stranger.
Yes, I can't even I can't order food without rehearsing it. There is no way I'm going out and murdering people.
I'm scared of making eye contact with the Girl Scouts waiting outside of Walmart right now. Like, I'm not. I'm not capable of it.
I order all of my food through apps, okay, to avoid human contact. That doesn't help me though because all of the employees at Taco Bell and
Know
McDonald's know
you.
who I am. They see my car, they go, "Okay, you're good to go around."
There's a lady who works in the bakery at Walmart,
Mhm.
and she used to work at Pizza Hut, and I have always been obsessed with Pizza Hut's breadsticks, and I would get them religiously. And so she doesn't work there anymore. And then, like, her first time seeing me at Walmart, she goes, "Breadsticks extra seasoning?" And I said, "Yeah." And she's like, "How are you?" And I was like, "I'm good." And so now every time she sees me, she goes, "How you doing?" And I'm like, "Good.
That's so funny.
Still getting breadsticks."
Anyway, John was known to be socially isolated, which is sometimes associated with the profile of the Ripper, but his lack of social ties and his tendency to keep to himself could suggest that he has like a likelihood for committing crimes without forming emotional connections to others. Couldn't be me though, because even though I'm socially isolated, I see an old person struggling, immediate tears.
Like that time that one was eating in a restaurant or something.
Yes, alone.
I think you like sent me like an 8-minute long voice memo upset about this old man or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. I remember there was one voice memo about an old person and you were upset and you said you were going to start crying
Yeah, I did cry.
because they were lonely. He probably just got away from his nagging wife and he's like, "Oh,
Now I
peace
have
at
to deal with
last."
this lady crying in the corner.
Yeah, and then Anna's over here like, "Oh my God, he's so alone. He has nobody."
I am an empath. So another one, Dr. Francis Tumblety.
I like that name.
He was an American who was pretending to be a doctor and was known for offering unproven remedies and treatments for various ailments.
You know what? I don't know how reliable I would find a doctor named Dr. Tumblety either.
Yeah.
It's a stupid doctor name to make up if you're not a doctor.
Yeah. He was known to collect body parts, particularly uteruses.
Okay.
He arrived in London around September 1888, just before the murders began, and he was still in the city during the peak of the killings. The doctor had a well documented hatred of women, which is one of the reasons he is considered a possible suspect. He was known to make derogatory comments about women and was disgusted by the female reproductive system, which is crazy for a man collecting uteruses.
And also the reason he's there.
Yeah. Um, he was like snake oil doctor, like through and through, basically. Like those people on the street who's like selling cocaine. This will cure anything you have.
I know 4 people that would die for that.
Cocaine?
Yeah, like if someone's selling cocaine on the street, they'll do it. I could name off 4 people that would probably like
Half our town. God.
they'd be fighting.
Yes.
Back then they're like, "Oh, there's that kook again selling drugs." Nowadays they'd be like, "Oh my God, there's the kook selling drugs."
Stop him. Hurry. Okay. So, this hatred towards women is a trait that's often associated with serial killers, particularly those who target women. In November of 1888, just after the last canonical murder, Tumblety was arrested on charges of gross indecency and assaulting women. He fled from London after being linked to the murders. Um, Although there were no formal charges that were filed against him in relation to the killings, there isn't any hard evidence against him, and he also wasn't in London for that long, but he was long enough that it could possibly be him.
So, was there any I mean, I don't know how much you was there any murders similar to the Ripper cases in the country he fled to?
I do believe he fled back to the United States,
I
so
wonder
I don't know.
I wonder if there were any similar cases.
Maybe.
Cuz that sounds so far I'm that one sounds most
Mhm.
plausible.
That's what I think too.
I guess that's why I'm agreeing with it because when you first started it, you put emphasis on one of the words and I was like, "Oh, maybe this one's the one that Anna thinks is."
Oh, the doctor? So, James Maybrick is one of the most prominent suspects in the Ripper case. He was a Liverpool cotton merchant, and his supposed diary was found in the 1990s. Which, where the fuck was it? It's been like in hiding for like 100 years, and all of a sudden it pops up.
Wow, look at
That's
this.
suspicious.
Yeah.
The diary contained details about the murders and phrases similar to those used in the Ripper letters. It contained detailed confessions to the murders, and the writer even boasted about killing 5 women in Whitechapel. The writer also references the police's inability to catch him and signs off with the words, "I am Jack the Ripper." The diary was found in an old chest belonging to the Maybrick's family. The authenticity of the diary has been widely disputed. Many experts believe the diary was a hoax, and the ink and paper were analyzed and show signs of being consistent with materials from the 1980s and 1990s rather than the 1880s. Despite the skepticism, though, the diary continues to be a key piece of evidence. Um, and there was also a rumor that he had a volatile temper and that there were stories about his possible infidelity, and his spending habits caused friction within his marriage. In 1889, Maybrick died under mysterious circumstances. I think maybe his wife killed him.
Oh, hell yeah, girl.
Like, poisoning people was huge back then. Like, arsenic, killing people with arsenic was like huge. While it was officially ruled as arsenic poisoning, some people speculated that it was an intentional act, either self inflicted or administered by his wife, Florence. So I think maybe he was like, he did probably have a temper, and his wife probably gave him arsenic so she could, like,
Live in peace.
yes. And, like, also life insurance money. That is just my opinion. So Walter Sickert was a famous British artist. He was fascinated with the Ripper murders. Some of his artwork contained disturbing scenes that seemed to reflect the details of the crimes. Walter's handwriting has been compared to the letters from Jack the Ripper, and there were some similarities in the style and appearance. He was obsessed with the murders, um, but it could have been purely artistic. But Patricia Cornwell funded a mitochondrial DNA analysis in an attempt to link Walter to the Ripper crimes. She supposedly traced DNA from bloodstains on some of his paintings and compared them to DNA found on the shawl, allegedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes. The mitochondrial DNA testing did show there was a match between the samples from Walter's paintings and the DNA on the shawl, which led Patricia to claim that he was the Ripper. Many experts dispute this reliability, arguing that DNA evidence was insufficient and the results were inconclusive. People have pointed out that DNA testing on such old items could easily be contaminated, and it was unclear whether the DNA actually belonged to Walter. I think that's probably plausible.
I'm not putting my money on this guy.
I'm not either. I don't really like him as like, sure, like, he could have just, like, people were so fucked up back then, like, he could have just been like, "Oh my god, this is huge, and, like, me redoing these paintings is gonna gain me, like, even more notoriety," you know what I mean?
Right.
Um, but yeah, mitochondrial DNA, like I said with Aaron Kosminski, it's widely shared throughout, like, anybody living. Anybody who has DNA probably has, like, matching mitochondrial DNA with people they're not even related to. So I don't think that should hold up. Um, Thomas Cutbush was a medical student. His mental health deteriorated and he developed paranoia and erratic behavior. He displayed erratic and violent tendencies consistent with a serial killer's psychological decline. He was also obsessed with knives and mutilation, which aligns with the Ripper's MO. In February 1894, The Sun published a sensational claim that Scotland Yard covered up Cutbush's identity as Jack the Ripper. The article stated Thomas's description matched witness accounts of the Ripper. He had a hatred for doctors, and his violent tendencies aligned with a serial killer's profile. He was institutionalized in 1891, meaning if he was the Ripper, his confinement would explain the end of the murders. Thomas was also younger than most descriptions of the Ripper, and there's no direct evidence tying him to the murders. But in my opinion, even with modern DNA testing, I still think it's unsolved. because Aaron Kosminski was a suspect, but the Shaw evidence linking him to the murders has major issues. The DNA analysis wasn't done in a way that holds up. There's like huge claims about like the credibility. I don't know. It's definitely questionable.
I think that the doctor one is most plausible because, like, especially with the last guy, like he might have had serial killer vibes, but he didn't. You didn't say anything about him having like a hatred towards women,
Mhm.
and typically when they like brutalize women in their genitals or like their sex organs, like that kind of shows like a real hatred for women. So I feel like it would only make sense for it to be, well, it wouldn't only make sense, but that's why I think the doctor one is so
Yeah. I'm
plausible.
definitely on board with it being Dr. Tumblety or um, Thomas Cutbush, in my opinion. Those are who I think. I don't listen. Sure, just because I don't know. I don't know anything. I'm just a girl. I'm just a girl with a laptop. Okay. There
That's
was.
actually really interesting. I've never actually learned about the Jack the Ripper case, and that was actually pretty interesting. And now I'm very interested, and I'm going to go home and Google about um the Tumblety and when he got to America,
Mhm.
because I do wonder if there were any similar cases in America.
Yeah.
And
Especially with him like traveling, because those kinds of people traveled and basically would visit like sickly cities, like huge cities. So at the end of the day, so much time has passed. And I think there's definitely been evidence that has been lost. And like records are obviously incomplete given that there was this whole theory with the witness and the lack of record with the Shaw. I don't think that it's ever going to be solved, but I do think that there are just like so many people who like are obsessed with this. Like even if it was solved, it's such like it's so huge with pop culture and everything. And there's like even anime and stuff like with Jack the Ripper in it.
uh imagine, I think Attack on Titan had Jack the Ripper. And then I think with like the one with the diary and how it was probably like written in the 1900s, it
Mhm.
definitely seems like that was probably like one of his ancestors,
Yeah.
like just trying to cling to like make them famous or something. Like, oh, I'm related to Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that one.
It's such a notable case too.
And then it's like when you watch those shows like Unsolved Murders and then you get all the way through the case and then they're like, and it was never solved.
Yes.
And you're like, what? You're not even going to give me an answer?
I know, I hate that so much.
Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook at Paranoia Pair Pod. And if you have any suggestions or like ideas that you want us to cover, put them in the comments. We'll see you next Friday.
Stay spooky.
Bye.